Welcome again, everyone, to our next lecture this week, English Settler Society. We're looking at Puritan New England. The two regions on which we're focusing this week, the early colonial period of America, includes the Chesapeake Bay and the Virginia colony, which we discussed in a previous lecture. And now the region that we come to know as New England, in particular the arrival of new colonists known as Puritans, principally in the colony called Massachusetts Bay. So English Settler Society, Puritan New England. Like Virginia, the same visions of empire sparked the colonization of New England. That is, the efforts by the English to establish settlement in the New World along the Atlantic coast north of the Chesapeake Bay, in the area surrounding what we know today as Cape Cod. It was called New England, and it was part of a larger effort that we've seen by the English, beginning with Ireland and then other spots along the North Atlantic coast of America, the North and Central Atlantic coast of America, North America, including the Chesapeake Bay, including the Cape Cod region. And some of the same investors, adventurers were involved in the New England effort, has been true earlier in Virginia, including the seemingly universal everywhere at once John Smith, Captain John Smith, who was in the employ of the Virginia Company as a explorer, land surveyor, organizer of colonial efforts in North America. The same expectations of implanting English authority, English economic interests, etc., in New England has been true of the Chesapeake a decade or so earlier. But what happens in New England is rather different than what happens in Virginia, largely because of a powerful stream of migration in the 1630s and 1640s, a time of tremendous migration by English settler folk in this case. You see from the illustration here the various streams of migration coming from England now in the middle decades, early and middle decades of the 17th century. Included here is Virginia, of course. We know that was a stream of migration mostly consisting of poor landless laborers, as well as a smaller number of actual landowners and planters to the Chesapeake for the purposes of growing tobacco mostly. Now the stream to Massachusetts, which by comparison is even larger, nearly twice as large in the 1630s and 40s as that to Virginia, is made up not so much of poor landless laborers as middling English settler families, farmer folk who are coming to this northern region of New England for the purposes of establishing communities. What we call the Great Migration or Puritan Migration saw about 14,000 Englishmen emigrating to New England, men, women, families actually emigrating to New England. Many of these folks were known as Puritans, and we'll say a bit more about that in a second. These so-called Puritans formed organized communities of religiously minded settlers who saw their migration to America in biblical terms as a, quote, errand into the wilderness, an errand into the wilderness, just like the Israelites of old. So clearly a different orientation here, playing upon the sort of zealous Protestant crusading mentality, but really reflecting a more defined, refined, even more zealous puritanical religious identity. These Puritan communities were established along the coastline of the northern Atlantic area. Here's the Cape Cod region I spoke of a minute ago. Here's Long Island in what becomes New York. And in between are the colonies that will be established during the Puritan migration, including principally Massachusetts Bay, but also the Plymouth colony, the famous Pilgrim colony at Plymouth, here at the base of the Cape Cod Peninsula, Connecticut, Rhode Island. These are the New England colonies, along with New Hampshire, and farther north, what was then considered a colonial frontier, Maine, making up the region we call New England. So yes, settling in villages along the coastline, these English migrants, these New World New Englanders, will form a distinctive cultural imprint of religious-minded, tight-knit colonial communities, the New England towns. In these towns were planted the seeds of pure Christian community. Thus the name puritanical or Puritan, derived from what was originally a taunt by their detractors, that is, back home in England, those who resented or despised the sort of righteous bearing of these sort of super Protestants, if you will, calling them puritanical as if an insult. But over time, this insult was borne with pride by those who embraced the idea of being somehow more pure in their religious beliefs, in their behaviors, puritanical, if you will, and worn as a badge of honor. Richard Mather, who you see here, was part of a family of Puritan ministers, 3 generations of Puritan ministers who will come to wield great influence in New England, who sermonize and write and preach about the Puritan mission of New England. Richard Mather, the eldest, the first of the Mather line, who migrates to New England, a Puritan minister who founds a veritable dynasty of Puritan leaders, including his son, Increase Mather, and grandson, Cotton Mather, all of them representative of the New England puritanical mindset. They intended to live simply in this new world, in this what they regarded as a wilderness, to live simply, imitating the life of what they believed was Jesus and the early Christian people, materially simple, ascetic almost, really, without the great sort of desire for creature comforts, plain in dress. You can see the Puritan frock here, nothing ornamental, just simple black and white. And again, shorn of ornamental display, this puritanical mindset and the material circumstances that reflected it meant to get individuals closer to the original meaning of Scripture, to live in effect by the words of the Bible, both in law and in behavior, and thus envisioned themselves as having a special mission in the New World, a kind of divine destiny, if you will, to rescue Christianity from its corrupted forms and practice, and to establish the true form of a Christian existence, not just in word but in deed, that is, in their daily lives. It wasn't enough to hear this in church on Sunday, but to live it the rest of the days of the week in a rather rigorous and disciplined fashion. All of this, by the way, is an outgrowth of the general Protestant restiveness in England. That is, as England had broken away from the Catholic Church in the 1500s and had established new commitments to the so-called Protestant faith, that is, the Christian beliefs that had separated from the Roman Catholic faith, and even separated in many cases from the Church of England that replaced the Roman Catholic Church. And so sometimes you see the name or read the name separatists, the Pilgrims being the most famous example. The Pilgrims were part of the larger Puritan migration, but they were a special colony established at Plymouth, and we'll say a bit more about them. Famously, the Thanksgiving celebration based on the Pilgrim example. And the Pilgrims were really just Puritans who had separated themselves entirely from the Church of England, whereas other groups of Puritans maintained at least nominal connections to the Church of England and so were non-separatists. But all of them really collected together here in New England with a sort of self-defined destiny, religious purpose, mission, goal, however you wish to put it, to rescue Christianity from what they saw as its corrupted forms and practice back in England and in Europe generally. I suppose this is most often characterized and symbolized by a famous sermon that a Puritan minister, lay minister, had delivered upon arriving in the New World. John Winthrop's "City upon a Hill" phrase will echo down through the ages, part of a sermon that he called a model of Christian charity. Winthrop was a Puritan leader and lay minister, that is, he was a civilian who often stood in the pulpit to deliver sermons, such as this 1630 sermon, the most famous, perhaps, of all Puritan sermons, called A Model of Christian Charity. And let's read it. He says, we shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, says Winthrop, a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the land. An excerpt from John Winthrop's Model of Christian Charity. And sometimes this phrase, city upon a hill, has been taken by enthusiastic politicians or patriotic boosters to suggest that somehow America, in Winthrop's vision, was to be the greatest of nations, that is, the exemplar of nations, but a kind of boast, in other words, a kind of patriotic boast. But really, when you look more clearly at what he was saying, Winthrop was saying that the Puritans would be, in effect, their communities would be a city upon a hill, or a city on a hill. That is, they would be under constant scrutiny. A place, a civilization, a society that could be clearly perceived by others, and thus under a burden to maintain their puritanical commitment. In other words, under the magnifying glass of doubters and those who would taunt or disdain the Puritan ways, so that if they were to make a mistake, if they were to fall from their commitments and to live less than puritanically, that not only would they come into ridicule, but the God who they chose to worship would also. That somehow riding on all of this was not only the reputations of the Puritans, but the reputation, in effect, of their God. So it's an onerous burden, not a patriotic boast, that John Winthrop is referencing here. This would be nothing less than a new England, away from the and separated from the impure church and the many sinners afflicting the old England. We talked in the last lecture about the social disruption and economic dislocation of the English poor, and how they were often reviled as beggars and criminals and thieves. And so the Puritans were anxious to get away from that corrupting element, that corrupting influence. For many Puritans, the daunting journey across the Atlantic was meant to be a kind of baptism, that is, sailing in their ships across the cold Atlantic, proved to be a transformative experience, a difficult journey, a daunting journey, one that, if you survived, would be akin to a rebirth, a spiritual rebirth. And thus it was with the famous Pilgrims. Their later governor, William Bradford, recalled that once they reached land, the Pilgrims of the Plymouth colony, quote, fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on firm and stable earth, their proper element. So a sense of transformation, a sense of rebirth, both religious, material, spiritual, communal rebirth in this New England. And thus inspiring, by the way, the myth of Thanksgiving. What more familiar story taught to American school children than that of the first Thanksgiving? Virtually the beginning of American history, I would think, as we often depict it, the famous meal held in common between the Plymouth colonists from England and their Indian allies of the Americas. The sharing of food, the breaking of bread, the teaching of certain native ways that allowed, particularly the growing of corn, that allowed these otherwise starving pilgrims to survive. And down through the ages, like in this Norman Rockwell painting from the 20th century, the celebration of a Thanksgiving, first proclaimed by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, this holiday, this third Thursday in November, would somehow capture the echoes of the early colonial period and romanticize the relations between the Plymouth Pilgrims and the native people of New England. Interesting because it suggested, among other things, a story of harmony, a story of cooperation, as we'll see, that was mythological at best. It's true that the English settlements mixed in a native heartland of New England what geographers call the eastern woodlands. So taking again a look at the map, bounded on the south by the New York colony, what was originally a Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam, but which would later become the English colony of New York and Long Island Sound. And then on the northern side by what was considered the frontier of New England, the Maine frontier, New Hampshire frontier of New England. And in between the Cape Cod Peninsula and its base, geographical base of what we call New England. You see here on this particular map that far from being a desolate wilderness, as was sometimes depicted, that this eastern woodlands region was chock full of native peoples. That is a quite thriving population of native people, including the Pequots of New England, the Wampanoags, the Narragansetts. These mostly reflect, by the way, language groups of people. That is, these names reflect native people connected by language. So the Mohegans, the Nipmucks, and many other, the Pocumtucks, the Munsees, the Mohawks. These are all native language groups that symbolize tribal alliances and sort of confederated communities of native people. So as you can see, a rather populous, rather almost crowded area where the first Puritan colony, the so-called Plymouth colony here of the Pilgrims, is established. All this reminds us that instead of a wilderness, native peoples transformed and humanized their landscapes long before the arrival of Europeans. The Europeans often chose to see it in terms of a desolate wilderness. This photograph of remnant Native American maize hills from the 1920s in Massachusetts. Maize had not grown in these abandoned fields for centuries by the time this picture was taken in the 1920s, but there's plenty of evidence in it of a landscape transformed. Still visible are the maize hills that native people had used to grow corn, what Europeans would call corn, thus transforming a landscape, clearing trees, establishing maize hills. For generations, this was the means of sustenance, that is, the planted crops of maize and squash and beans amidst the landscape of New England. You might pass right by it. If you didn't know better, you might assume nothing at all had ever been done to this landscape, but it again is evidence of a landscape transformed. This sketch to the left, made by the artist John White in the 16th century, shows a native village of the Atlantic coast depicted with a tall palisade that is ringed by a defensive palisade made of cut trees and implanted in the ground to form a cordon or wall, a protective wall. The village itself, the native village itself, likewise characterized by constructed dwellings made from building materials from the nearby forest. Speaking of which, the nearby forest cleared here to present a kind of clearing of settlement, again suggesting a transformed or humanized landscape. As the writer Charles Mann says in his book 1491, the Indian impact on the American ecosystems was transformative, subtle, and persistent. And yet, compounding the mistake, really, English settlers who viewed it as an untouched wilderness, I think compounded their error, because instead of seeing the wilderness as somehow naturally beautiful, they viewed it as a forest primeval, a place void of civilized people, an almost demonic place, a place that echoed from the deepest fears of the English themselves. As William Bradford called it, a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men. Well, if you're sort of following the narrative here, you're getting that really the way the English chose to describe this place went a long way toward justifying and legitimizing their own dramatic transformation of it, including their relationship with the native people, because unlike the Thanksgiving mythology, the relationship between the English settlers, the Puritan settlers, and the native people, far from harmonious, far from cooperative, really. Ultimately, it was a relationship defined by conflict, because to the Puritans, the harsher the environment, the more it had to be tamed, the more nature and the people living in it had to be tamed. And if not tamed, then overcome. And if not simply overcome, then vanquished, so that the larger landscape could be domesticated for the purposes of English settlement. The first 100 or so Puritan immigrants we call the Pilgrims, crossed the Atlantic in the Mayflower in 1620. Half of the newcomers did not survive the first long, hard winter. As William Bradford wrote, if men desire to have a people degenerate speedily, and to corrupt their minds and bodies too, let them seek a rich soil that brings in much with little labor. But if they desire that piety and godliness should prosper, let them choose a country such as New England, which may yield sufficiency with hard labor and industry. Basically, this is a classic Puritan message. In other words, it eschews ease and comfort, and embraces instead sacrifice and struggle and hard labor, because it was thought that only by committing oneself to this disciplined, rigorous existence would one be sufficiently puritanical. That is, to be otherwise was to be distracted from one's religious course. It's sort of the idle hands make for the devil's workshop theory of existence. This required their own dramatic reworking of the New England environment, of course, from a natural wilderness, as they perceived it, to a landscape of cleared forests, wide fields, farms, and fences. So a reworking of the native landscape now into a Puritan vision of a landscape transform. Native peoples had a very different conception of nature and ownership, of course. It wasn't as if the natives did not transform their own landscapes, or that, like the Puritans like to describe, that somehow they lived in a wilderness, a desolate wilderness. But rather, they transformed the landscape in a way perhaps more subtle. They too were agriculturalists, as we saw before, but they mixed their crops together in forest clearings rather than in the starkly segregated spaces, the fields and fences of the English land tenure. This was enough for the English to claim that the native people really didn't have ownership over the land. And thus the Puritans' relationship with the native peoples was much more complicated and often destructive than the Thanksgiving mythology suggests. And there are some tragic examples of this, such as the destruction of the Pequot village on the Mystic River in 1637, what became Connecticut. The attack on the Pequot village by English militias caused the death of nearly 400 women and children. You see in this famous sketch the battle lines formed, the English militiamen with their firearms, the native warriors with their bows and arrows outside the palisaded Pequot village, whose inhabitants eventually would succumb to the burning fire and raining of weaponry, if you will, down on them. A famous destructive attack by the English for the perceived non-compliance of the Pequot people with English law and deed. As one of the militia commanders, John Mason, put it, God was above them, who laughed his enemies and the enemies of his people to scorn, making them as a fiery oven and filling the place with dead bodies. In other words, Mason claiming that the enemies of God had scorned the English customs, that is, that the native people had disobeyed the English dictates and thus suffered a burning death. Basically, the village was put to torch by the English, and the result was a tragic loss of life, but a loss of life that was justified by the English settlers as necessary for the Christianizing of the landscape. Ironically, the Native American was also used, however, as a symbol of purity by the Puritans themselves in the customs of white New Englanders. That is, adapting the native figure as a symbol of purity rather than the demonic image of godlessness, in this case, a symbol of purity shorn of the corruption of English society, a kind of noble savage, if you will. The Massachusetts Bay Colony seal, which the Puritans brought with them from England, featured an Indian holding an arrow pointed down in a gesture of peace with the words, "Come over and help us," emphasizing the missionary and commercial intentions of the original colonists, thus combining God and commerce in one single image. And it was through this commercial connection that the New England villages and towns and cities would connect to the larger Atlantic world. Here you see a map from the 17th century showing ships coming in and out of the river inlets and harbors of New England, a place of commerce through fishing, trade, shipping. The New England fishing industry, for example, becomes enormously important to the economic success. One could not live by God or bread alone, as it turns out. Industry was required, revenue was required, and the fishing industry of New England proved to be a gold mine for the early towns and settlements. An estimated 6 million pounds of fish caught per year by 1675, most of it shipped and sold to European markets. And yet, as with most things Puritan, there was a contradiction seemingly lurking at every angle. Here, a successful fishing and shipping industry caused conflict just as it brought in revenue, caused conflict for Puritan religious authorities, as fishermen, shipwrights, and sailors did not always want to conform to the strict puritanical biblical biblical laws that regulated everything from drunkenness to assault to blasphemy to Sabbath breaking and, of course, fornication. A more earthy lot were the fishermen and shipwrights and sailors who inhabited towns like Boston, and they often disagreed with the Puritan magistrates as to the basic propriety of behavior, of human behavior. As the religious officials had it, the main end of planting this wilderness, meaning the New England colony, was a dedication to religion. So said a New England minister of the 17th century. But for others, including a local fisherman, there was a different goal in mind. "Sir, you think you are preaching to the Puritans," said this fisherman. "Our main end was to catch fish." Some here are of the opinion that as many men may share a woman as they do a boat, and some have done so, according to a magistrate's investigation of 1644. So what these little snippets of quotes suggest is fundamentally competing visions of life and work among the Puritans. With the Puritans, of course, towing the line as best they could to their religious vision, while others who were attracted to New England for fishing, for shipbuilding, for a variety of purposes really, often did not necessarily wish to buy into the strict puritanical creed. So what we get in New England then by the late 1600s is a complex commercial economy, a complex cultural landscape that defined the place we call New England. With no single cash commodity, that is agricultural cash commodities such as tobacco in Virginia, New Englanders had to be very resourceful and entrepreneurial. They had to find other means of revenue and subsistence, such as the lumber and fishing industries, which saw New England commodities being exported to the West Indies. For example, in return for West Indian commodities, the English colonies of the West Indies that produced molasses, rum, sugar, and slaves, which could then be re-exported to the Chesapeake in Europe. But as you can imagine, the arrival of molasses and rum would have destabilized the otherwise abstaining or teetotaling religious communities of New England. And though the Puritans were willing to take a bit of sacramental wine, let us say, occasionally, they did abstain from the more injurious forms of spirituous liquors, such as rum, or at least they tried to, but it didn't stop others. It didn't stop the fishermen and the lumberjacks and the shipwrights from imbibing and carousing and creating, therefore, a kind of cultural conflict at the heart of the Puritan landscape. The ships which plied the trade of the West Indies, which visited the ports of New England and the ports of the West Indies, and in fact the transatlantic ports of England itself. From 1674 to 1714, New Englanders built more than 1,200 ships. And Boston had become the principal port of Massachusetts. Boston alone had 15 separate shipyards. It is then, in a great part, by means of New England that the other plantations are made prosperous and beneficial, said Edmund Randolph, a Virginia planter, who recognized the great advantage of having the New England shipbuilding industry, serving the other colonial ports as well. Of all the American plantations His Majesty has, none are so apt for the building of shipping as New England, said Josiah Child in the 17th century. So yes, from fishing to lumber and timber to shipbuilding, the Puritan vision had to make room for now a bustling commerce, a bustling capitalism, a manufacturing and trade establishment that sometimes settled uneasily among the more ascetic, more religiously inclined Puritan establishment. But in the end, there was also a kind of blending. That is, the Puritan mindset made way for the industriousness and laboriousness of these industries, accepting also that profit and revenue and wealth was a sign from God of earthly success. Okay, so that is part one of the Puritan New England lecture. We'll come back here with part two to describe further how this unique cultural and religious and commercial landscape makes an imprint in the early English colonies of the errand into the wilderness that the Puritans had it. That is, of the arrival of English settler folk in the continent of North America.